Let's talk about the 3 most infamous people I met over 19 years in prison. We have the son of a German diplomat convicted of a brutal double murder. We have a suspected serial killer who says it was all a setup by the CIA. And we have a kid with a promising future who everybody liked, but turned out to have a terrible secret. So the first, Jens Soren. In the 80s, he was a Jefferson Scholar at UVA. He was brilliant, he was shy, he was awkward, and he met a girl. Unfortunately, this boy meets girl story did not go the direction people would want, because it wasn't long after that her parents were brutally murdered. Initially, Jens and his girlfriend weren't even suspected. They just went on about their lives. But there was so much violence and so much anger at the crime scene, as well as some other factors that came into place, that eventually they became suspects. So they took to the road. He was from Germany, he had connections, they managed to get to Europe where they bounced around for a year and a half, finding ways to make ends meet and living some love journey that they had. But eventually they were arrested in England for passing bad checks. They were noticed that their passports were fake. They ran the name, ran the numbers, and they were like, oh, well, these people are wanted for murder in America. But the interesting thing is, because England wouldn't deport to a place that had the death penalty because they were opposed to it. So eventually the arrangement that had to be reached was that Virginia would take the death penalty off the table, or they would remain in a jail in England. They were finally brought over here. There were international headlines. His diplomat father was involved. It was a huge deal. Eventually, she said he did it, that she had basically stayed behind, but she had plotted and she accepted responsibility. He said she did it. She pleaded guilty. He fought it in trial. He was convicted. She was sentenced to 90 years. He was sentenced to serve life in prison. Now, from day one, he continued to claim his innocence. The only problem was when he was in England, he had admitted to the crimes. Now, his explanation, and I actually can understand this, was I thought I had diplomatic immunity. I was saving her. I was trying to make sure she was okay. If I took the rap, they couldn't have convicted her. But it does seem fairly underhanded that after him doing that, she would just throw him under the bus and say that he did it, including a thing she said in trial about the fact that he was impotent and he couldn't get it up, which just seemed to be a completely unnecessary detail. It was just a personal jab. So I don't know what was going on between their dynamic, but it obviously wasn't good. But he continued with his pleas of innocence, explaining why he did about pleading guilty or admitting guilt when he was in England, and he started to garner support. He started to get people who were actually on his side. Former law enforcement, former investigators, people with great public reach. I mean, he had authors and music producers. He had all these people behind him. And this built up to where he was applying for clemency or applying for a pardon or hoping that he would get parole, because we still had parole back then. It wasn't abolished in Virginia until 1995. So he garnered this support. I mean, he had lines of people coming to see him, people sending him money. He wrote books while he was inside. He managed to build this entire industry basically around himself and his claims of innocence. He was actually granted a pardon. This is the wild part. He was granted a pardon by one governor and he was going home. And he was like, oh my God, my life is over. And he got on the news and started saying, I'm going to tell the world how corrupt Virginia is. And I'm going to, unleash all the hell of... And the next governor who was coming into office, because generally pardons are given at the end of a governor's term, immediately revoked his pardon. And one of the explanations is, dude, you got on TV and top crash. Like, you basically said you were going to destroy the Commonwealth of Virginia. The new governor came in and revoked your pardon. Now, the interesting thing is the governor who revoked his pardon was later convicted of crimes and sent to federal prison. So it wasn't like he was really the most upstanding citizen either. But it's funny because I talked to Jens about that, and he said, me and that governor had a lot in common. We had a bad woman take us in the wrong direction, which didn't really seem like accepting full responsibility, but at the same time, I could see the parallels. Finally, not many years ago, he was actually granted parole. The governor basically just said, hey, we want to get him out of our state and be done with it. He and his then girlfriend were both granted parole. She was returned to her home country of Canada. He was returned to Germany. But after all those years of those claims of innocence, he was welcomed as a hero and welcomed as somebody who had been wrongly convicted, and a perfect example of what happened to, for example, Amanda Knox. He had a book tour. He made an insane amount of money. He was, part of films and professional events. And then there started to be kind of cracks in the story. There's an amazing podcast that goes into it in depth if you're interested. It's called Small Town Big Crime. And it goes into everything from the story, where there were some cracks in the story or the way it kind of fell apart, to DNA testing that he's now refusing to have done. He's home. He's happy. I always wonder if him and his then girlfriend, her name's Elizabeth, are still in some kind of long distance love power struggle or push pull. Whatever it is, it was incredibly traumatic. But it was interesting to be in a prison full of people where, the most famous guy was a guy who had a couple keys on the block, and all of a sudden we have this guy who has the German chancellor writing him Christmas cards and who's meeting with billionaire record producers, and it was fascinating to see this different kind of world that was possible in there. And the thing that I appreciated about him, because I remember when I first met him, I'd heard a bunch of bad things, some good things, but he was smart. He could talk about any topic or any subject. We could discuss religion or philosophy or literature, and I appreciated that because there weren't that many people that I could have that discussion with. So every time I got a chance, I would talk to him. And some people would say, man, why are you talking to that guy? All the bad things. And I said, he's a person. We're all in here together. It's not like I'm going to judge the person next to me. As I said, Jens is now off living his life, and I'm happy for him, for anybody. Whether you do something terrible or not, if you're living a good life, if you've done something to make amends, cool. If he's actually innocent, oh my God, that's horrendous. He would spend more than 30 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The second was my serial killer roommate, old Greg Barker. So what I knew of Greg Barker was he was this little old man who was nice. He worked the quality control in the wood shop where I worked. And I got moved into his cell because I got a job in the woodshop. The way that is, they house people centrally for each job, or at least they did there. Like you would have a kitchen pod and a woodshop pod. And so I moved in there. Little old man, I said, oh, this is great. And it was kind of this avuncular creature, or avuncular kind of character in my life. He taught me how to shave because when I first went in, I couldn't shave. I was too young. And so I was suddenly having to like learn how to shave, and he taught me about going with the grain and going against the grain. We would watch Jeopardy every night, and he would demolish me in Jeopardy. He would help me with my vocabulary. He would give me words every day, things that I should learn or things that I should do or books that I should read. And he helped me a lot with my college classes because I was enrolled at that point. It took 15 years to get my college degree. And he really kind of helped boost me along. So I was thinking, this is a great roommate. This is not some, young kid who's loud and crazy and going to drive me nuts. And it's not some, old guy who's just hard to get along with. It was easy. But then my stepmother, who had lived in Japan when my grandfather was doing missionary work over there, I said to her, this poor guy, he never gets any mail. He never, he never talks to anybody. Nobody visits him. I know he was stationed in Japan for a number of years. But that's the other thing. He was a highly, highly decorated Vietnam veteran who served years and years in the military. And so I said, would you write him a letter? Would you just say hello? Maybe compare your time in Japan. Maybe you could just brighten his mood. I told him, I said, look, I asked her to do this. I don't know if she will, but I'd really like to see you. I just think you're a great guy, which should foreshadow that I'm apparently a terrible judge of character, or that people are complicated. So she came to see me a few weeks later, and she said, Jesse, I've got to tell you something. You know that guy you wanted me to write? And I said, yeah. She said, he's a serial killer. I didn't really know how to react to that, so she started giving me the details of this. He was convicted of one murder in Virginia. That's what he was in prison for. He'd apparently also been convicted of a string of bank robberies out in Las Vegas, and a military base that he had served on. They found a slew of bodies. They basically found all these shallow graves where people had been killed and buried. He had been on that base. He was connected to each of the people who was killed. It was just this wild story. So then I go back to the cell and I'm like, well, do I tell him? I don't know. Whatever possessed me, I said, hey, Greg, I got to tell you something. You remember how my stepmom said she was going to write you? And before I could even get it out, he just kind of laughed and said, yeah, you did your homework. That was terrifying because I saw a different side of this little old man who, instead of just being the sweet little old guy who would, sometimes get frustrated at work, I could see someone who was capable of like incredible violence. And I guess I should have known that. I mean, he served in Vietnam. He did a lot of stuff. He did stuff after the war. But what I remember the most, or the thing that stands out to me the most, was he spilled his coffee one day. He used to always sit the same way in front of the locker, in front of his TV, and he spilled his coffee, and he just started screaming at himself, like, stupid, stupid, stupid. And the only thing that I could imagine, or what I felt like, I was imagining some mother, like, beating her kid, because that's exactly what it sounded like. And he was basically beating himself. He was chastising himself. It was horrifying to watch. And he kind of cleaned this stuff up, and he was just red in the face, and he was angry, and then he just sat back down like nothing had happened. And I saw this outburst of rage that was terrifying. And I always wondered, because again, he was that guy. He taught me so many things. There are different sayings that he had. I remember him talking about his service in Vietnam, that everyone in his unit, he would make them get up in the morning and shave, whether they wanted to or not. He would make them take a nip of liquor at night, because he said it wasn't so much the act of shaving or the liquor, it was the discipline, and it was having a clear start and an end to every day, whether that day was 12 hours or whether that day was 36 hours. You had to have boundaries in life or everything would blur together. I don't know why, but that just always stuck with me. One of the other things he said, it's a quote, he says, violence is the last resort of the inept. And I always took that quote to mean, oh, like violence is only for stupid people and only as a last resort. But his point was, no, sometimes violence should be the first resort. And I'm not saying that this is something we should do in our daily lives, but his point was this, like, what if it's just violent words? What if to prevent something from coming to a head, you can stop it in the beginning? You can make it clear, like, this is not going to work. Or you can make a threat of action to make that action unnecessary. And having grown up in like a weird pacifist home with a dad who had been a criminal and done plenty of violent things, I had never really thought about that. I'd never really thought about what justified violence was. I'd never really thought about a case in which, hey, maybe I need to set a boundary now or do a small thing so I have to avoid doing a big thing later. And it's interesting to have this conversation or get these lessons from a guy who is suspected of killing, I think, 13 people, but nonetheless, there was a lesson there. And it's interesting because Greg had medical issues, and he ended up getting transferred from where I was to Greenville, where they had a better medical facility, or supposedly had a better medical facility. And I remember I had somebody look him up a few years later, and he wasn't in the system. So I thought he had died. And it was bizarre because I did a video about him, and somebody reached out and said, hey, I was, I think, a staff member at Deerfield, the hospice prison. Said I was a staff member at Deerfield, and I remember him. He was scary. It was something about his eyes. He was still sitting there, just a sunken body. I remember thinking, was he in the system this whole time? Had they disappeared him? No idea. But again, he was one of those fascinating people who was an incredibly valuable character in my life, who taught me things, who added value to my life, but also had done absolutely horrendous things. And I always say he's a reminder that people are not just one thing. They can't be oversimplified. Now, the third most infamous person I know, and he wasn't infamous for the entirety of his time, was this young kid named Robert. He'd been arrested at 16, he had come in as a juvenile, and he had a murder charge. That's all any of us knew. And he was a good kid. He played violin at some special school, he got good grades. Everybody thought he had a bright future ahead of him. He was the one who had kind of like broken the cycle of poverty. and he was going places. But he had this murder charge, and everybody assumed, oh, it was a family beef, like his brother drew him into something, or oh, it was a neighborhood beef or something happened. Nobody looked further. And it's interesting because people always ask about checking paperwork, and with Greg or with anybody else, the old school in Virginia was that you don't ask and you don't tell. You don't ever ask somebody what they're in there for, and you don't ever tell anybody. So guys just kind of went on peaceably about their day without knowing what anybody was in there for. But this younger generation came in and they started checking people's paperwork. Like, oh, you want to use the phone? Like, we need to see your paperwork. Oh, you want to do this? We need to see your paperwork. And it's definitely shifted in that direction now, but the older school just didn't care. So when Robert came in as a juvenile with a murder charge, nobody asked any more questions. They were just like, all right, cool, like, he's good. So one day, we're all sitting in the pod, and somebody starts yelling, man, Robert's on TV, Robert's on TV. And Discovery Channel was doing this investigation Discovery special where they were highlighting all these true crime cases, and one of them was about Robert. And it was showing him at school where he was being interrogated. I mean, they actually came to his high school to interrogate him, and he was suspected of brutally murdering this girl. And basically what it turned out, what he actually told someone later, was that, yeah, if she's going to show them attention, she needs to show me attention. So he broke in with the intention of violating her, and when she fought back, he took her life. So this was a kid who everybody in the prison liked, who thought was a good kid, like just thought was going in the right direction. We learned this, and we were horrified, because this was not who we thought he was. Again, there are lots of people with murder charges in cases that are understandable, not justifiable, but understandable. This was one where everybody realized this guy's a predator, like he has acted as a predator. And it was horrifying, because so many people dealt with him on a daily basis. And the question was, what's going to happen to him now? Because he was 16 when it happened. Had he been like a 30-year-old man who had done that to a 16-year-old girl, it would not have gone well for him. But because he was young, he kind of got a pass. He was always kind of stuck to the side or kind of shunned, but people didn't really have time for him anymore. People didn't want to talk to him anymore. He goes on about that, and he kind of starts like lipping back to people or mouthing back to people. I remember he got into it with this old man named Chuck. Prison humor is a unique thing, but Chuck was this frail old man who used to just run his mouth, basically trying to get somebody to kill him. He was probably 100 pounds. If somebody had hit him with a wet towel, he might have died. He was just this frail old man. And they kept going back and forth. They were going back and forth. And Chuck said to Robert, he said, you couldn't get any more D in your mouth if you was on your tippy toes. And it was the most bizarre insult that everybody had heard. The pod just broke down laughing. And Robert's sitting here, he was maybe 19 or 20 at that point, with this 70-year-old man just looking in his face. He said he didn't know what to do. He couldn't hit him. He knew he'd get a charge or he'd hurt him. So he just smacked the oatmeal the guy had off the table, and everybody laughed even harder. So Robert didn't really have a good time of it. He grew more angry, and just that same kind of like incel behavior of like, oh, if, I deserve this, or people have to give me this. So he got into an argument with a guy one day and started arguing. And the one thing you don't tell somebody in prison, you don't tell them to suck my d, you just don't. So he says that to this guy, and this is one of the old school guys who has a knife in his cell and is ready to use it. Sure enough, the guy goes up the stairs, and Robert just thinks like, oh, he's just putting on a show, or oh, he's just gonna go get his boots and we're gonna fight, or whatever. Guy grabs a big knife, starts coming at him, and Robert realizes like, oh, this is not good. Puts his hands up, gets stabbed through his hands in multiple places. The guy gets him down on the ground. Robert's kicking him, but he gets hit in the chest, he gets hit in the stomach. I mean, he basically gets poked up pretty good. There's blood everywhere, it's going absolutely crazy. And nobody's really got Robert's back because of the stuff that he did, because of everything else, nobody's gonna intervene. Finally, the officers come in. Like I said, there's blood everywhere, people are slipping. Robert couldn't even stand up, there was so much blood, and it was his blood. Apparently he never passed out, which is the fortunate thing for him, because if he had passed out, that guy would have killed him. So he goes to the hospital, and basically the only way Robert worked his way back into good graces with people is when they tried to take a street charge out on this guy, Robert refused to testify. Because for an institutional charge, all they had to do was look at the cameras. Probably for a street charge, they could have convicted him with just the cameras, but they didn't really want to bring charges for things in prison. They would only do it with a cooperative witness if it was as easy as possible. The county just knew it would cost them money. Like, it would cost them money to prosecute, it would cost them money to get a defense attorney. They just didn't want to do it. So a lot of times you would have stabbings, or you would have knife charges, or cell phone charges, or drug charges, and they just wouldn't prosecute because they didn't want to deal with it. When Robert refused to testify against that guy, and he came back on the yard out of the hospital, he was kind of given a pass. Like, all right, you did something really stupid, you did something really horrible, but at least you didn't tell on somebody. So that was really his pass. But there were a lot of other things in the story that were just absolutely bizarre. And again, it's a reminder that we don't know everything. Just like Greg wasn't just one thing, Robert wasn't just one thing with everybody. The way he was with guys clearly wasn't the way he was with women, because he was never trying to take some guy's life because they didn't sleep with him. Those were the 3 most infamous people I met over 19 years in prison. I hope you enjoyed this story. Like and subscribe, and I'll be back with more.